Welcome to week 3 of the Hebrews course. This week we will be looking at what's called the catena of Hebrews 1. A catena is a chain, and there is a chain of 7 Old Testament quotations in Hebrews 1 from verses 5 through 14, kind of like on a string. That is some of the, again, most exalted language of the New Testament, I think. And so we want to look at this chain of Old Testament quotations and the way the author of Hebrews puts them to work in his argument. And I've titled this vodcast A Celebration of the Enthroned Son, which gives you some sense of what my interpretation of that chain of quotations is, and I'll explain that in a second. But let's dig right in as we move on. What is the timing of this chain? In other words, how are we to locate these quotations in the story of salvation? And this is what I was just talking about when I call it a celebration of the enthroned Son. I'm tipping my hand and arguing that basically these chains of quotations should be pictured in relationship to Christ has been led into heaven. He is seated at the right hand of God, and everybody bows before him. All the angels bow before him, and this pop, pop, pop chain of quotations in Hebrews 1 is a celebration of the fact that Jesus has been enthroned as cosmic king of the universe. And there are, of course, scholars who disagree with this. And so I'm going to make my case for why I think that's the way that we should picture Hebrews 1, 5 through 14 in the context of a celebration of Jesus sitting down at God's right hand. For one thing, the context clearly and quite strongly pushes us in this direction. Last week we saw that the exordium, the first 4 verses of Hebrews, end with this statement, that Christ sat on the right hand of majesty in the heights, having become, see that he sits, having become as much greater than the angels as the name he has inherited is greater than them. The timing is very clear here, in at least my mind, that it is as Jesus sits on the right hand of God that he becomes as much greater than the angel. Now that may seem theologically difficult, but here we have to remember that in chapter 2, well, let me just say what I just said. The sequence implies that Christ inherits the greater name and becomes greater than the angels at the time of his exaltation. This fits in with chapter 2, where it says that we see the one who was made lower than the angels for a little while, Jesus, who is crowned with glory and honor after he suffered death. And so again, in the world of Hebrews, Jesus is a little lower than the angels while he's on earth. And then when he is exalted to God's right hand, he becomes greater than the angels as he inherits this name, which is, what is the name? We're going to get into it, but I'm going to say that the name is primarily Son of God. In other words, it's the title Cosmic King. And the context and the traditions that we find elsewhere in the New Testament are so strong that I really strongly say that the burden of proof is on any commentator who says anything different than what I'm saying, namely, that the location of Hebrews 1, 5 through 14 is the exalted Christ. I said the context of Hebrews 2 and the context of Hebrews 1, 3, and 4 points us in that direction. He became lower than the angels in his exaltation and seating at God's right hand. He becomes greater than the angels. And so the dun-da-da-da of the catena is, look, he is greater than the angels. And that context pushes us to understand each of these quotes in relation primarily, not necessarily exclusively, but primarily to the risen Christ. And you'll see why there's why many scholars disagree with that. You'll see that as we go through these individual quotations. The other reason is not just the context, but some of the traditions that we find in the rest of the New Testament that I talked a little bit about last week, that place Jesus receiving the title Son of God, Lord, and Christ most directly. Not that we can't call him Son of God and Lord and Christ at other points of his existence, but the traditions in the New Testament locate most directly the giving of those titles as he sits at God's right hand, as royal titles that have to do with him being king. And so both of those, both the tradition, which is exaltation focused, and the context, which is exaltation focused, in my mind, imply that you're going to have to work really hard as a scholar you're going to have a hard time convincing me that I shouldn't read each of these quotations in the light of the fact that Jesus has been exalted to God's right hand. This is what I just said. In the timing of Hebrews, Jesus was lower, then exalted over them in his resurrection. Okay. Our default, again, this is stuff I've already said, I'm ahead of myself. Our default expectation is that the Catena contrasts Christ with the angels in his exaltation, contrary to others who see the Catena in relation to Christ at all points of his existence. And here there's a famous article, or a well-known article by John Meyer, arguing that these quotations are a chiasm. A chiasm, you might remember from inductive Bible study, is where you have an A, B, C, C, B, A kind of structure. It could be A, B, B, A. But basically it's like a pyramid where the first and last parts are similar. And what John Meyer argues is that we have the first and last parts are about the exaltation. But as we move in, it's Christ at the beginning of creation, maybe, so forth. I'm going to argue that the entire Catena should largely be understood in terms of the resurrected and exalted Christ. Now, what is the name? I've already said that I think the fact that we go straight into the Son of God title strongly pushes us in the direction of Son. There are other arguments that I'll mention in a second, but basically he says, having become as much greater than the angels as the name he has inherited is greater than them. And then we get this verse, for to which of the angels has he said at any time, you are my son, today I've given you birth. See how son is the title that immediately follows on having given a name more excellent. And since 1:5 is backing up what he's just said, having inherited a name, then son, if son can be a name, and that's one of the issues, is son a name? That's not really a name. I mean, Ken is a name, Yahweh is a name, son is not really a name, and so some would argue that son is not the name. However, since I believe onoma, the Greek word for name, can refer to a title as well as a proper name, I think that the context immediately, at least, pushes us in the direction of Son of God being the title that he has inherited that is more excellent than angel. We'll see whether there's other factors that nullify that. I'm not convinced that there are. As I've just said, this substantiates the previous verse, and so our impression is that the title that he inherits, the name that he inherits, is Son of God. Okay, however, Richard Bauckham has argued vigorously for Yahweh or Lord as the name. You'll recognize that the word Lord in Greek often is what is regularly used to translate Yahweh in the Old Testament. Yahweh is, of course, God's proper name. It's what's on all of his envelopes and all of his letters. God is not God's name. God is a category. Yahweh is a proper name. When the third commandment says you will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, it may be applicable to swearing or saying God in a context where you're not actually referring to God in a casual way. That may be a kind of a ripple effect of it. But the name that third commandment has in mind is Yahweh. Do not invoke the name of Yahweh in vain. It's talking about oath taking. Do not swear by Yahweh and then not keep your oath. Quite different from what you normally hear people talk about in relationship to that third commandment. But my point is that Bauckham argues that God's name is Yahweh, Yahweh, which is translated as Lord. And therefore, it makes more sense to say that the name that he has inherited, that is more excellent than the angels, is in fact Lord or Yahweh. What are some of Bauckham's arguments? Well, because it is, as I said, it is actually the name. Son, according to Balcom, is not a name. It's a title. Yahweh is a name. Also, there is this sense that sons inherit their father's name. Now, obviously not last name. Yahweh is not God's last name. But just to get a sense of what the argument is here, it's the idea that we understand that sons, sons get their father's names, and so what Balcom basically is arguing here is that to go right into talking about the son doesn't contradict that the name is Yahweh, because of course sons get the names of their fathers. And to me, all of that is that doesn't make sense. I mean, to me, none of that's definitive, because these are arguments that largely, it seems to me, proceed out of modern ways of conceptualizing names and relationships. What I think Balcom's strongest argument, and what I suspect is the strongest driving force behind his position, is the fact that in other places in the New Testament, like Philippians 2, the name does seem to be related to Yahweh. When Philippians says, and therefore God has highly exalted him and given him the name above every name, and Balcom says, how can this be anything other than Yahweh, the highest name above every name? And so, of course, the Philippian hymn goes on to say that every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, that Jesus Christ is Yahweh, Balcom argues. And that's a plausible argument to me. And so I feel that tug, that if we have sound traditions elsewhere in the New Testament where Lord is the name that Jesus inherits at his exaltation, then why not here in Hebrews 1 as well? And let me say that I'm willing to see that there is that even though it seems to me Son of God is what is primarily in the bubble above Hebrews, the author of Hebrews' mind, I'm willing to see Lord, that is Yahweh, Son of God, Christ, all of these as related kind of royal titles that are associated with the name Son of God. But as we'll see as we go through the Catena, it's always Son. He comes back over and over again to Son. But to the Son, he says, when he leads his firstborn son into the world. And so there's so much of a predominance of Son imagery in this chain of quotations and Lord really doesn't play that big of a role. Why I'm not convinced. Context points towards Son. A title is a name in the Greek usage of the word onoma. And then Yahweh doesn't really play a role in the Catena. The only place where the word Lord is used explicitly is in 110, and it doesn't seem to play a central role in that quote. So this is, in my mind, it's a hard call, but it's one of those instances where I would have thought that Lord would be the name, maybe because of the background, but ultimately the individual context has to trump. The individual context has to be the decider. The author of Hebrews was not a slave to the traditions. And so although I think Lord is related to what he's saying, it just seems like he has Son of God on the brain. So Balcom has not convinced me on that point. This is my compromise I just said. It may be wrong to limit it to one name, since all of these are different ways of getting at the same role of cosmic king. Okay, what is the structure of these 7 verses? How are they arranged? Well, first of all, there's an inclusio between 1:5 and 1:13. What's an inclusio, you ask? Because you're a little rusty on your inductive Bible study? An inclusio is where at the beginning and the end of a section you have similar words or similar thoughts that kind of bind that section together. For example, many would say that the book of Matthew has an inclusio because in chapter 1, Jesus is said to be Emmanuel, God with us. And then in chapter 28, where Jesus is giving the Great Commission, he says, Lo, I am with you always. So you have this sense of God with us in the form of Jesus at both the beginning and end of Matthew. There's an inclusio between 1:5 and 1:13. Both of them begin with the same exact wording in Greek, the same exact question with the same exact words in the same exact order. And what this does is it kind of signals the beginning and end. You know, a good pastor tells you what he's going or she is going to say, says it, and then tells you what she has already said. So that's the introduction and conclusion often to something have similar themes in them. And basically, the fact that the first and last quote in these sequence of 7 have the same exact words, I think indicates that this is clearly a unit of thought in the author's mind. Not that you ever doubted that. So that's part of the structure. 1, 5, and 6 are also structured together. How? The first one says, "You are my son," and again, "He will be a son," and again, whenever he leaves his firstborn son. So we've got son, 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 which again, all due respect to Professor Balcom, son seems to be the main theme that we're getting in this, not Lord. So you are my son, and again, and again. So these 3 son quotes, the first 3, go together in some way. And we'll get to the interpretation of those in a second. Then this next part, 7 through 12, are grouped together because of what is called in Greek a men de construction. Men is often not translated because it doesn't come out as good English. This is why you should know at least a little Greek, because there are clues there that translations often omit. Men is a clue that you have a contrastive relationship going on. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. And in the chain of quotations in Hebrews 1, this men de construction lets us know that verse 7 is on the one hand and verses 8 through 12 is on the other. What this means is that we have to look at one, we have to keep going back to 1:7 in order to really hone in on what the author is doing with 8 through 12. And this is where I differ from some other commentators in that they don't really do that. They just take the content of each quote and then match it to what makes the most sense in their dictionary of Christian theology. And the problem is that may not be what the author was actually trying to do with these quotes. And so you'll see where I differ with some other scholars on exactly how to interpret some of these quotes. So in terms of the structure, verse 7 is on the one hand in relation to the angels, and then 8 through 12 is on the other hand in relation to the Son. Oh, look, it's the Son again. We have a lot of Son going on here, and no Lord yet going on. So again, I think that the name is primarily Son of God. Reminder, the context, this is before we get into it, that the context of this chain of quotations is the exaltation. My argument. We are set up by the context to expect these 7 quotations to be a celebration of Christ's enthronement. By the way, the structure I just did, in my mind, pretty much eliminates the whole chiasm idea. What I mean by that is the chiasm. A chiasm would be structured pretty well in concentric circles: first, last, second, second to last, third, third to last, and then the middle. But that's not the grammatical structure that we find in this chain of quotations. The grammatical structure is, yes, first, last. I'll give you that. But the first 3 go together, and then the next 3 go together. So you see, it really doesn't balance out the way we would expect if, in fact, it was a chiasm. Okay, moving right along. And this is what I just said. The structure doesn't lend itself well to chiasm. Apache John Meyer. So, we have a visitor here.
I just want to thank you all for taking this experimental class with Ken Skank. I hope you're finding it as fascinating as I am lurking in the background watching it happen. So, love you guys. Have a great experience. Bye.
Class would be a lot more interesting if you were in here all the time. So. That's a word from our sponsor. Okay, 158. The first quote, and our batter up, our first contestant is, "For to which of the angels has he said at any time, 'You are my son'? Today I have given you birth. We've already given you this quote. In the previous podcast, as I said, the title Son of God is a royal title. It relates most directly to Christ's enthronement. Now, Bishop Westcott and others, and again, I'm not opposed to this. I just want to make it clear that when Bishop Westcott brought his Orthodox Christian eyes to Hebrews, and when others bring their Orthodox Christian eyes to Hebrews, the resonances they hear with the words are appropriate resonances, and yet they are not often they are not what was in the author of Hebrews' minds. This is this dualism that I live in these two worlds. You'll have to decide whether, in fact, one of the other worlds is wrong. Of course, don't pick orthodoxy as the wrong one. The orthodoxy is the one that we, by faith, have to affirm. And yet, there is this question of the original meaning, using ancient context, literary context, historical context, tradition context, that sometimes pushes us in distinct, not necessarily contradictory, but distinct directions from what the tradition, the later traditions of the church might push us into. And so, when I read Acts 13:33, and it says, God has exalted him, as it is written in the Psalm, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Clearly, the context is not thinking about the pre-existent Son from all creation, which is the way, of course, that Bishop Westcott, in his commentary from the late 1800s, took this being it's an eternal decree that he is the Son. The Son is eternally begotten of the Father. We believe that as Christians. That's not what Hebrews, or at least the author of Hebrews, was thinking about. He was thinking about the Son taking the title of royal Son of God at God's right hand when he's exalted. Similarly, Romans 1:3, and declared to be the Son of God in power by the resurrection of the dead. So you see that the original meaning locates this enthronement as Son. And of course, Psalm 2 was originally probably an enthronement psalm. There's a first meaning that the Psalms often had in relation to the Davidic king, and then, of course, there's often a messianic meaning that we find in those words, and the New Testament finds in those words. But they are two distinct meanings. And the original meaning of Psalm 2 likely had to do with the enthronement of a very human king on the throne. You are my son. Today I've begotten you. Today you're being enthroned as king. Okay, 1:5b. And again, I will be to him a father, and he will be to me a son. Again, the original meaning of this is David praying to God regarding Solomon. God assures David that he will be a father to Solomon. Again, we have this multiple meaning to this Old Testament text. The original meaning, where it's a prayer about God's relationship with Solomon. And then, of course, the New Testament meaning, where the author of Hebrews takes this to say that the Messiah will be the Son of God. And again, it fits into an enthronement context, doesn't contradict it. Royal connotation, perfectly appropriate for a coronation kind of context, where at that moment, in a sense, as the person is crowned king, they become the Son of God. 1:6, and again, when he causes his firstborn to enter into the inhabited world, he says, and let all the angels of God bow down to him. Okay, now here's where you can see where John Meyer begins to argue that, well, this doesn't have to do with the exaltation. When does God lead his firstborn son into the world? Why, it's at the birth. And so we have here we started off with the exaltation, but now we've flashed to the incarnation. Hold off on that. So there's a certain common sense to that. After all, this verse sounds like it's talking about the incarnation. It sounds like it's talking about the birth. Now, given what I've said so far, the burden of proof is to show me that that's in fact what this is talking about. The context is not pushing us to hear these words in relationship to the birth. The context is pushing me to see whether I can understand these words in relation to Christ's exaltation to God's right hand. Now, just some mechanics. This is a form of Deuteronomy 32 that is in a Septuagint form. perhaps in wisdom. It's actually something called, in worship, I mean, it comes from something called the Odes. The Song of Moses is in the Odes, and this is from the Song of Moses. Um, Here's what that text says: Rejoice, heavens, together with him. Let all the angels of God worship him. Rejoice, nations with his people, and let all the sons of God sing to him. Now, the actual form, let all the angels worship him, isn't actually in the Septuagint of Deuteronomy. And if you, right now, in fact, I recommend you go ahead and pause this video and get out your Old Testament and see if you can find it. See if you can turn to Deuteronomy 32, verse 43. Go ahead and turn to Deuteronomy 32:43 and see if you can find these words. Let all the angels of God worship him. I doubt you're going to find it. Well, you're not. You're not. I can't imagine any version that you have where you turn back to Deuteronomy 32:43 and you will find, and let all the angels of God worship him. Now, you will find something, I think, similar to that. I think you'll find let all the sons of God worship him in maybe the new RSV. I personally think that the new RSV is, of the translations I know, the most accurate Old Testament translation in relationship to the original meaning. But anyway, that's a kind of a side issue. But basically, what does this tell me? This tells me that the author of Hebrews is using a Septuagint form of the Old Testament. If I can get the thing to work here. The author of Hebrews does not function out of the Hebrew Old Testament. In fact, there's no evidence that the author of Hebrews even knows Hebrew, that is. The author of Hebrews functions primarily out of the Greek Old Testament, which is, as we've said, an argument that it is a Greek-speaking person. Now, Paul actually mostly functions out of the Greek Septuagint. But we will find a couple of places in Hebrews where the author of Hebrews is using a text of the Old Testament that is not apparently the original text of the Old Testament. It would be like if you were to preach from Mark 16:20 in the King James Version, and then find out that Mark 16:9 through 20 weren't actually in the original of Mark. There are a couple of places, and this actually may not be one of them, because here I think actually the author of Hebrews is following a more accurate text of the Old Testament than, say, the one we have most of our versions. I think actually this is a case where the Septuagint is more original. But there will be another place when we get to chapter 10 where the author of Hebrews follows a form of the Old Testament that I believe was not the original form of the Old Testament. So that raises some issues about whether the importance in using Scripture is the message rather than the jot and the tittle. We'll have that argument another day. But okay, so the author uses this Greek form of the Old Testament. When, and here's the question, when does this take place? When does God lead his firstborn son into the world and say, let all the angels of God worship him? When? There are three main candidates. First of all, could this be the incarnation? And that's the one that a lot of people go for. They go for it because it sounds like the incarnation. When he leads his firstborn into the inhabited world, let all the angels worship him. It sounds like the incarnation. Secondly, it could be the second coming. When he leads his firstborn son into the world when the judgment's going to take place. So that's a possibility. Thirdly, could it be the exaltation? And of course, that's where I'm going to come out on this. In fact, just to see whether you're actually listening to these vodcasts, you might just emphasize the differences between Skank and the other, whatever commentators you're using on this point, because I differ pretty significantly from many commentators on this point. That kind of let me know that you're actually listening to these and not just skimming through the PowerPoints to get it done. But let me go through the arguments for these. The argument for the incarnation is, of course, the fact that it sounds like it's about the incarnation. I think, again, the burden of proof is on that person, given the context. And my arguments for the third point will address why I don't think it's the incarnation, in addition to what I just said. Could it be the second coming? You'll notice that this verse started, the way I've translated is, and again, when he leads his firstborn into the inhabited world. Well, you could also translate it when he leads his son into the inhabited world again, which puts it into a kind of a second coming context. And remember that the odes that we read to you, rejoice, O heavens, rejoice, O nations. It goes on to say, because the blood of his son is avenged, and he will avenge, and he will repay justice to the enemies, and to those who hate he will repay, and he will cleanse, the Lord will cleanse the land for his people, the land of his people. Well, there is a kind of a judgment edge to the Song of Moses that is being quoted here. And so it is certainly possible that this, you could argue that this is in relation to the second coming. That wouldn't necessarily contradict uh, the exaltation context in the sense that that's all part of the new age. I mean, his being exalted and his sitting. I mean, what is it? Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And so there's a sense in which Jesus sitting at God's right hand anticipates the judgment of the world. So a second coming context would not contradict my overall interpretation. I've in the end not come down that way because I think of this structure. And he says, and again, and again. And so you see, there's too much of a parallelism in the structure. He says, and again, that I don't think that it's more like, I don't think it's likely that the again goes somewhere else other than at the front. So why do I go with an exaltation context? Well, first, I go with an exaltation context because that's the way the overall context is pushing us. Secondly, there is this similarity in the three. He says to his son, and again, all of which the first two clearly have to do with his enthronement in terms of his sitting at God's right hand. And so it only makes sense to me that the third one would also be about him sitting at God's right hand. And the third one has to do with the word oikumene, which means inhabited world. I guarantee you that whatever commentary you read, if they disagree with my position, they're probably going to say that inhabited world refers to the civilized world, the Mediterranean world, not the barbarians up in Gaul or whatever, or in Germany, but the civilized, inhabited world. That's what this word means. Yes, that's what this word generally means. If you look it up in a dictionary, in the first 50 or 70 AD dictionary, Greek dictionary, you're going to find that oikoumene literally refers to the inhabited world. However, you cannot pigeonhole an author by the general usage. Ultimately, what this word means for the author of Hebrews depends on what this word means for the author of Hebrews. And is it possible that the author of Hebrews has defined inhabited world differently from the way the word is normally used? In other words, metaphorically. Well, give me some evidence for it, Skank. I will. How about in chapter 2, verse 5, where he says, "For it is not to angels that he has subjected the coming inhabited world concerning which we speak." The coming inhabited world. What does this tell me? It tells me that the world that he's talking about is the truly civilized world, not the Roman world, not the civilized world of the Greco-Roman culture, but the eschatological world, the world that is coming, the world of salvations. What's the world of salvation? What is this context of this coming world? Well, 1:14 says it's not to angels that he is. Are they not all ministering spirits sent for ministry to those who are about to inherit salvation? So again, the coming world concerning which we speak is the world of salvation, the world that is to come. And since I think in chapter 2, the created realm is removed, then obviously for me it makes sense to say that the truly civilized world, the world of salvation, is the unshakable kingdom in heaven that belongs to the coming days, the salvation of which we speak. And so I think that the context strongly implies that he did not lead Jesus into. If this verse says that when he leads his firstborn into the inhabited world, and it's talking about the ordinary earthly world, that goes against what the author's theology is. The author does not look, we seek a country, we seek a better country, a heavenly one. The author has relocated space toward heaven. This is also fits with the idea that Hebrews is written after the destruction of Jerusalem, because all of this earth, this world, the inhabited world, is not this world. It's not the world of the Romans. It's not the world of Jerusalem. It is the true Zion that he talks about. We have come to Mount Zion, he says in chapter 12. What is he talking about? He ain't talking about Jerusalem. He's talking about heaven, where there are 10,000s of angels in assembly. And so to me, it makes perfect sense to say that he leads him into the true world, the truly civilized world, into heaven itself, and the angels bow down. By the way, again, when did the angels bow down to him? When did he has become greater than the angels? It's in the exaltation. And of course, this is a royal context. The word used for worship here, proskuneo, is a word that applies to bowing before a king and so forth. So to me, all of the evidence points toward an exaltation context rather than toward an incarnation or a second coming context, although the second coming is a close second in my mind. Okay, now we go to the next section, which is 7 through 12. First, we have, remember that 8 through 12 are, on the other hand, they're the contrast with this verse, on the one hand. So 1:7, and to which of the angels, on the one hand, does he say, the one who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire? I might, a little tangent here. Notice the disjunction. If I were writing a novel, I would say, and to which of the angels does he say, your winds and ministers in flames of fire? That's kind of worded funny, isn't it? To which of the angels does God say, the one who makes his angels winds and his minister a flame of fire? That's a little disjointed. I think part of the key is to see that the author believes that God speaks through Scripture. And there is a truth that God would speak to us through the Scripture that says, the one who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. What is the truth that we take from that? Well, first of all, it's slightly different from the original Psalm 104. He makes the winds his messengers and flames of fire his ministers, something like that. You'll get this for sure before we're done with this series, that the author of Hebrews, as all the New Testament authors, does not follow the methods of IBS in reading the Old Testament. They spiritually move things around. The meanings they find in the Old Testament are often not the meanings that they had originally. The idea here, he's taking, making the winds his messengers, messenger being, makes the winds his angels. In Psalm, he switched it around to he makes the angels winds. The word for spirit and the word for wind can be the same mean. The word for spirit can have the meaning of wind. Okay, so what do we learn about angels? Well, they have a changing ministry. Winds and flames. Wind blows where it will, flames flicker. These are not absolute ministries. What I mean is they change. They are transient. They're changing. That's one of the things that we should get from this statement about the angels. They're also servants. They're ministers, as we saw in verse 14 already when I mentioned it. Ministers of those about to inherit salvation. So angels are servants. They are servants in a transient kind of changing way. We also know from later on that they're mediators of the law, the words spoken through angels. We'll get into this next week, but you can see that Hebrews 2:2 is not the only New Testament verse that understands angels to have been involved in the giving of the Old Testament law. I might mention Jubilees. The book of Jubilees is an intertestamental book. Nobody ever thought it was Scripture, but that is, no Christians ever thought it was Scripture, at least not that we know of. Jubilees was probably considered Scripture by the Essenes. Dates from probably around 150 BC. Here's from the book of Jubilees. On the first day God created the heavens and the earth and all of the spirits that minister before him, like the angels of his presence, the angels of the spirit of fire, the angels of the spirit of the winds. You can see that angels are um, associated with things like fires. And of course, in the wilderness, there's a pillar of fire by night, um, so forth. So angels were understood to be associated with some of these sorts of things. They were probably thought in their worldview, in the ancient worldview, to be made up of very thin material, but they didn't have this two part of the universe view where you have the natural and the supernatural, where the natural is material and the supernatural is non-material or immaterial, but rather there's a continuum of being going from the rather solid beings down here to the farther you go up, it becomes thinner and thinner, kind of gassy being or fiery being, even some thought. One philosopher suggested that there's a different substance of heaven, that whereas you have earth, air, fire, water down here, it's ether up there. Thus, we get the word ethereal, heavenly. But I just thought I'd point out that angels were probably conceptualized by ancient Jews as being made up of very thin kind of material rather than them being immaterial. Um, okay. So what does this verse 7 contrast with? Well, here's the first contrast in 8 and 9. When he makes his angels winds, and his ministers a flame of fire. But to the Son he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the staff of straightness is the staff of your kingdom. You loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. For this reason God, your God, has anointed you king with oil of exaltation in the presence of your companions." So this is the contrast with angels. What are our observations here? This fits well in the context of enthronement. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. You've been anointed. Notice anointed. Therefore, God has anointed you in the presence of your companions. Who are the companions here in the author's mind? Are they the angels? Maybe that fits chapter 1 better. We'll see that brothers are companions in chapter 2, but maybe angels for the chain fits better. Because he's become greater, than the angels. He's been anointed. And so he's your throne, O God. We're putting you on the throne. We're exalting you to God's right hand. Now, originally, Psalm 45 was a wedding psalm. It was a psalm that related to the wedding of a king. We can tell this because the king has virgin companions in train, and the princess is bedecked with ornaments and those kinds of things. And we're hopeful for the king to have many sons. And so, as we've seen, the Old Testament context is often not exactly the same as the New Testament context. But so Psalm 45 is a wedding psalm, and it is somewhat shocking that in that wedding psalm, the human king is called God. Your throne, O God. Of course, not that he is God like the God. In fact, we see in the quote, "Therefore God, your God," there's a distinction between the king as God and God the Father, who is God. The king is representative God. And so in that sense, we see that the church has worked out. Jesus is definitely an upgrade to what the Old Testament king was, no doubt. In fact, we learn out that Jesus is fully God. In God inspires the church to work through these issues, that he is of one substance with the Father. The author of Hebrews isn't even asking those questions. But anyway, the main point of why does the author quote this Psalm 104, I believe it is. Why does he quote that here? Well, we have to go back to verse 7 to find out what the point is. What's the point of the contrast? Well, angels are transitory, and they are messengers. But Christ is eternal, and he's a divine king. They're servants, he's king. They change, he's eternal. So it's very important for us to look back to verse 7 with these two quotes here to figure out exactly what the point is, because of course he's just quoting. Okay, so then we get to 10 through 12. And, so this is the second. The first one contrasted with verse 7. This is the second quote that contrasts. Actually, I'm sorry, it was Psalm 45. This is Psalm 104. That contrasts. You at the beginning, Lord, see how flimsy evidence Balcom has to say that Lord is the name, because this is the only place where Lord appears in the chain. and it's not highlighted at all. It's just kind of stuck in there. You at the beginning, Lord, founded the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. They themselves will perish, but you, by contrast, will remain. They all will become worn like a garment, and as a wrap, you will roll them up. As a garment also, they will be changed. But you yourself are the same, and your years will not be exhausted. This is, of course, plays into my understanding of Hebrews 12, that the author of Hebrews sees the creation being removed, not just transformed, but removed in the eschaton. But not the point today. This is the second reference and the last reference in Hebrews to Christ as creator. Here, directly as creator. You, Lord, founded the earth, as opposed to verse 2, where it's through whom God made the worlds. So there's two possibilities here. One is the one that I'm open to being convinced otherwise. Since most scholars disagree with me, I have to consider strongly the possibility that I'm a loony. But I've not been convinced yet that I'm wrong to fall off the log on this direction. This could be highly metaphorical. Again, notice that the location of the title Lord in the tradition is God exalted him and gave him the name Lord. Or in Acts 2, God has appointed this Jesus whom you crucified Lord. The location of Lord is usually at the exaltation. He is Lord, he is Lord, he is risen from the dead, and he is Lord, risen from the dead, he is Lord. Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, which means you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, resurrection. So again, the location of receiving the title Lord in the tradition is usually at the exaltation. And so the metaphorical approach is that, in a sense, Jesus founded the earth because he is the inheritor of them, that he is the one through whom God made the world. He is the wisdom for the world. He is the meaning of the world. He is the purpose of the world. So that's one approach. The other approach is, of course, to take it literally, that when Christ sits at the right hand of God, he resumes the former role over the creation that he had before, takes up the mantle of Lord that he had in creation. In some way, maybe set aside when he became human, but now he resumes his place over the creation. Okay, but what is the main point? And here again, it's so easy for us to get caught up in the quotes and forget that these quotes are being put to a purpose, an argumentative purpose. And the purpose is to contrast the Son with the angels in verse 7. In other words, the main point is not that Christ is the creator. The main point is, with verse 7, angels are transitory and are messengers. Christ is eternal and Christ is Lord. So those are the main points that we should get from 1:10 through 12. Closing it all up. So now the author has made this argument, for to which of the, having become as much greater than the angels as the name he has inherited, for to which of the angels, as he said, you are my son, and I will be a father to him, and he will be my son. And again, when he leads his firstborn into the truly civilized world, he says, bow down, all of you angels. But on the one hand, to the angels, he says, you guys are like winds and flames, servants and messengers. But to the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Therefore, you loved righteousness, and that's why God has given you this authority over divine authority, cosmic kingship over the creation. And in fact, you found the earth. You give meaning to the creation. The angels are part of the creation. The angels are like winds and flames, but you founded the earth. And while the earth will be rolled up, your kingship will go on forever and ever. Your days will never be exhausted. And so let's wrap this up. After all, to which of the angels has he said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Again, what is the summary? What you say what you're going to say it, say what you said. When he says what he said, he says, he's king. Come sit at my right hand. This is clearly the exaltation that the author of Hebrews has in mind. This is one of the, Psalm 110 is alluded to many times in Hebrews. This is the place where it is explicitly quoted. And of course, it's associated with Psalm 2. You are my son, today I've begotten you, in early Christian tradition. Both 1 Corinthians 15 and Ephesians connect these two, blur these two. Early Christians clearly understood them to be connected in prophetic way. So what is the function of the angels? The last verse of this chain. Are they not all ministering spirits sent to minister to those about to inherit salvation? Well, sure, yes, they are. That's their role. Their role is in relation to humans in the Old Covenant. And so as the Old Covenant comes to an end, the role of angels also is coming to an end. So this concludes the beautiful chain of quotations in Hebrews 1. That Jesus sat at the right hand of God, having become as much greater than the angels as the name he has inherited is greater than them. For after all, to which of the angels has he ever said, I am crowning you as son. Today I am giving you birth, and I will be your father, you'll be my son. And, by the way, let all you angels worship him and bow down before him. But to the angels he says, okay, you guys, you're like winds and flames, messengers and servants in the creation. But Jesus, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. You've been exalted as king over this whole shebang. And in fact, you founded the creation. They're the works of your hands, in effect. And your work, while they will come to an end, and let's wrap it up, he's going to keep going. The angels, which of the angels did he say, you are my son? Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet. They're all ministers in the kingdom. They're servants, sent for those about to inherit salvation. So, the catena of Hebrews chapter 1.